China's plan to invade the relatively small yet globally significant island of Taiwan may be hitting a major roadblock. The Philippines, backed by the US, could influence China's invasion plans in a major China-Taiwan conflict. But what is it about the Philippines that makes them play such a pivotal role in this scenario? In the year 2023, Taiwan became the most strategically important piece of real estate on Earth. This de facto independent island nation 110 miles off the coast of the Chinese mainland sits at the center of the world's economic and geopolitical fault lines. Since it came to power in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party has regarded Taiwan as a renegade province, a relic left over from its long civil war and the century of humiliation it climaxed. This was the period between 1839 and 1949, where China repeatedly found itself invaded, defeated, occupied, and partitioned by foreign powers. Taiwan's self-governing status is a reminder to the Chinese leadership of those times, and reunifying it with the mainland is one of the most important objectives for China's authoritarian leader, Xi Jinping, who hopes that the process will be completed by 2049, the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's ascendancy to power. There are many obstacles to this plan, but one of them is not so often cited: the Philippines. Let's take a look at the Philippines, its tense relationship with China, and how this nation threatens Beijing's grandest foreign policy ambition. Taiwan is important to the Chinese leadership not just for historical reasons, but because of its economic and geostrategic position. Economically, Taiwan hosts the world's most advanced semiconductor industry through the dominance of one company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. In 2021, Taiwan had 63% of the world's semiconductor market share, with 54% of the world total being through TSMC alone. These chips are at the heart of the world's digital economy and power everything from computers to the brake sensors in cars. For China, gaining control of this industry would be very desirable. Placing itself at the heart of the globe's high-technology supply chain has been a major priority for its geopolitical strategy, as seen in its Made in China 2025 plan. If the semiconductor shortage of the past few years made things more expensive, Beijing getting to dictate the supply chain of these vital components would increase the price tag of almost everything much further. Geopolitically, Taiwan also sits at the center of the first island chain, the series of islands that span from Japan to Indonesia. These islands act as a natural obstacle to China's expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Restoring Taiwan to Beijing's rule would break this chain and allow China to freely access the world's oceans without having to go through the choke points that the first island chain presents, such as the Strait of Malacca or the Miyako Strait. Controlling these choke points is one of the United States Navy's principal strategies for containing Chinese military expansion. If China were to take Taiwan, however, it would have the land and ports it needs to bypass those choke points, making containment much more difficult, if not impossible. The United States is Taiwan's most important potential ally. Officially, America treats Taiwan with a doctrine of strategic ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying that it would come to the island's defense if it were to be invaded. But under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, it has long sold sophisticated weapons to the island nation to deter such an invasion from happening. With this equipment, Taiwan has pursued what it calls a porcupine strategy, fortifying itself as heavily as possible and building offensive assets to deal damage to the Chinese mainland, all to increase the costs China would incur for an invasion and hold out as long as it can while it awaits the aid of its allies. Japan would also play an important role in the defense of Taiwan. In December 2021, the late former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said the United States and Japan would not be able to stand idly by if Taiwan were attacked. In 2022, only a few months before his shocking assassination, he urged the United States to drop strategic ambiguity and affirmatively say it would defend Taiwan. A Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency, he said, because China establishing air superiority around Taiwan would cover Japanese airspace. A takeover of Taiwan would also allow China to threaten Japanese shipping even more than it does today with its militarization of the South China Sea. Japan is a resource-poor nation and must import raw materials and commodities to survive. It cannot allow China to dictate what goes on in the region's shipping lanes. However, for all the talk about Japan and its role in a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, far fewer people talk about the role the Philippines would play in such a scenario. Thanks to a renewed agreement with the United States, this is starting to change. and Taiwan may soon be able to count on the aid of the Philippines as it stares down the colossus across the strait. The Philippines, though much smaller than the United States and Japan, also has a keen interest in seeing that Taiwan does not become subject to the Chinese Communist Party, and the Philippines has now become a major player in the dispute over Taiwan. The entrance of the Philippines into the Taiwan question is a natural consequence of the diplomatic and military rivalry between it and China, which has occurred in the last decade. The Philippines and China have long had a bitter dispute over the waters of the South China Sea. In 2012, China seized control of the Scarborough Shoal, a rock with valuable fishing sites and hydrocarbon reserves that rests within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. It was the start of a conflict between China and the Philippines over several rocks and island chains in the South China Sea. Other points of contention between the two nations include Mischief Reef and the Spratly Islands, all of which China went on to occupy and fortify. The Philippines brought a suit in international court, and in 2016, a tribunal in The Hague ruled that all of China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, based on a 9-dash line map drawn in the late 1940s, had no legal basis. Still, China ignored the ruling and occupies these rocks and islands to this day. China's aggressive policy in the area has naturally alienated the Philippines, which is a longtime ally of the United States. The United States has had bases throughout the Philippines since the Spanish-American War of 1898, but its presence is now starting to expand much more. The Filipino military is not a formidable fighting force, meaning that China has mostly been able to get its way in its disputes with the Philippines, despite the international tribunals ruling against it. The Philippines has an active army of about 100,000 active duty personnel, a navy with only a few vessels more fit for fighting than patrol boats, and about 25 combat aircraft. This means that militarily, the Philippines would contribute little to the defense of Taiwan, at least for now. However, the Philippines does have two advantages: its geographical position and its alliance with the United States, which it has now begun to ramp up ties with again after a period of frostier relations. In 2014, as the South China Sea dispute began to ramp up, the United States and the Philippines signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA. Under the terms of the EDCA, the United States would be able to expand its military presence in the Philippines, although the 2014 document did not specifically state where it would do this. Rather, the document only affirmed the principle that the armed forces of the Philippines would provide new locations for the United States Armed Forces. In 2016, 5 such locations were formally announced. These were, from north to south, Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija, Besa Air Base in Pampanga, Mactan Benito Ebuen Air Base in Cebu, Antonio Bautista Air Base, and Lumbia Air Base in Cagayan de Oro. Of the 2016 locations, Antonio Bautista Air Base was the most important, as it was close to the disputed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. However, as China's military buildup in the region has only grown since 2016, the United States and Philippines announced plans to further accelerate the EDCA in February 2023. In April, the Pentagon announced the creation of 4 new EDCA bases. These are Naval Base Camilo Osayas in Santa Ana, Cagayan, Camp Melchor de la Cruz in Gamu, Isabela, Balabac Island in Palawan, and Laulo Airport in Cagayan. Not coincidentally, 3 of these 4 locations are in the northern Philippines, which makes the intentions of that expansion clear. The new bases are to help deter a potential invasion of Taiwan by allowing the United States to more easily project power into a critical area, the Luzon Strait. The Luzon Strait is one of the first island chain's strategic choke points. It is a 160-mile gap of water between the Philippines and Taiwan. The Philippines' northernmost island, Mavulis, is even closer, at only 118 miles away from the world's most disputed hotspot. Here is where we see the role that the Philippines would play in the defense of the world's most hotly contested island. In the first place, the bases give the United States and its regional allies additional options to choke off shipping to China. As China is heavily dependent on foreign food and energy imports, this is something that the country's leadership will need to take seriously and helps aid the process of deterrence. Geographically, the bases strengthen a potential new front to counter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan if deterrence fails and hostilities actually become a reality. In the necessary amphibious operation, China would now likely be facing a pincer movement of forces moving south from Japan and north from the Philippines, adding to the already immense difficulty of pulling off a successful waterborne maneuver and establishing a beachhead across the Strait of Taiwan. An amphibious invasion is hard enough. An amphibious invasion that would need to fend off American and Allied forces on two sides, that would be almost impossible, especially with a lack of surprise on the invaders' side. The bases also better prepare the United States and its other allies in the region, such as its Quad partners Japan and Australia, for war. Their locations make them ideal places to stage military exercises simulating an invasion of Taiwan. Although there is no true substitute for actual combat operations, the better prepared military force will usually get the better of an engagement, something the Chinese brass should know well, since the principle goes all the way back to Sun Tzu. The new bases in the Philippines certainly increase the preparation the United States and its allies can make for a coming invasion. The renewed military partnership between the United States and the Philippines also offers the prospect of improving that country's military readiness as well, which, as we have seen, is badly needed. As China's policy in the region has routinely seen the Philippines bullied, it is likely that policymakers in Manila will want to take advantage of the opportunity that the new bases provide. Indeed, the United States and the Philippines have already conducted drills in the Luzon Strait, which will lead to improved Filipino readiness in the long run. Someday soon, the Philippines could join joint exercises not only with the United States, but with its partners in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Japan, Australia, and possibly even India. The new bases in the Philippines also help to reduce one of China's major advantages, which had been eroding the United States' share of the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. Namely, the bases help to mitigate the tyranny of distance. This term describes the disadvantage the United States would face by fighting thousands of miles away from its homeland. It would need to ship troops, supplies, and other essentials over those thousands of miles of ocean, where China's troops and supplies would only need to travel a little bit from their homeland. The vast distance also has a negative effect on morale at the home front, because it makes Americans wonder what the war is really about. This was a big factor in contributing to the political controversies in America's interventions in Vietnam and Iraq, and it is a tradition that goes back to the earliest days of the country's history. With China's development of anti-access area denial (A2AD) capabilities, the tyranny of distance has magnified. The long American supply lines would make ripe targets for China's A2AD strategy. But the bases in the Philippines give the United States more options. It can now position many more assets close to the area where the fighting over Taiwan would be taking place, making China's A2AD harder to carry out. For example, China has an arsenal of thousands of ballistic missiles that threatens all of America's bases in the region. But the more targets there are to hit, and the more air defense systems get concentrated along the bases, the faster China's missile depletion becomes. Some of the missiles will hit, but the bases in the Philippines mean that now China has more targets to hit and more air defense systems to deal with. The bases in the Philippines ultimately mean the attrition math will shift more in favor of the United States and its allies, even though they would still take terrible damage in an all-out Chinese missile attack. Still, surviving assets can more confidently be brought forward to act when the reign of missiles ends. In this way, the new bases in the Philippines are in line with the United States' third offset strategy, which it codified in the mid-2010s. Meanwhile, the new base means that the United States will be able to position more assets that can hit the Chinese mainland too, further undermining China's A2AD strategy and increasing the costs of a conflict exponentially and further aiding deterrence. The agreement with the Philippines, however, prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons in the bases, so the EDCA is not a nuclear umbrella type of agreement. That is one of the few items of solace for the Chinese leadership. For the Philippines, the renewal and expansion of the EDCA marks a return to its traditional close relationship with the United States. Despite the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, Rodrigo Duterte, president of the Philippines from 2016 to 2022, flirted with forging closer relations with China in order to reduce the country's dependence on the United States. His successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has proven more traditional in pursuing the Philippines' alliance with the United States. The new base also includes an investment worth over $82 million for infrastructure and access to resources for those bases. This investment will be a good source of jobs for local Filipino residents, meaning that they aid the United States not only in its projection of military power, but economic influence. Therefore, aside from the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, the bases also affect one of the cornerstones of Chinese policy: economic coercion. China has long used its financial and industrial power to exert leverage over the domestic politics of other nations. We have even witnessed this in action in the United States, with certain Hollywood filmmakers carefully curating their content to not offend Chinese sensibilities, and the 2019 controversy in the NBA about the fate of Hong Kong, which was erupting with protests at the time. The effects are far more profound elsewhere. For example, China has used its economic leverage over many Muslim-majority nations to buy their silence regarding the treatment of its Muslim Uyghur population in its western Xinjiang province, which the United States State Department, the British Parliament, and several other governments around the world have formally classified as genocide. China's infrastructure investments through its Belt and Road Initiative, among other projects, have also given it leverage over countries receiving the funds. Although the Philippines is technically a member of the Belt and Road Initiative, its Chinese-sponsored infrastructure development there has only been limited and is highly controversial among the Filipino public. Despite China's attempts to make inroads, the United States and its respective companies remain the heaviest source of foreign investment in the Philippines. The situation has limited the Chinese government's ability to exert economic coercion over that country. In the past, Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership could have hoped to buy at least the neutrality of the Philippines concerning the Taiwan issue, but with the new bases and both the military and economic ties that it brings with the United States, this possibility just got sharply reduced. The failure of China to bring the Philippines into its orbit, despite the 6 years of friendly Duterte presidency, severely threatens Beijing's plans for Taiwan. Geographically, the Philippines is just too important to the success or failure of an operation to take the island. The Philippines now actively coming onto the side of the United States makes the already difficult operation even more difficult for China, and the problem is only likely to get worse for Beijing. Unlike China, the Philippines is increasing in population. It is expected to increase from the current 117 million to about 180 million by the end of the century. Meanwhile, China's population peaked in about 2020 and is now declining. It is expected to shrink from 1.4 billion to about 776 million by the end of the century. The Philippines' economy is growing as well, with an average annual GDP growth of 6.4% since 1990. As the Philippines' population economy grows, it will be an even better source for American investment, and the new wealth will give the Philippines the opportunity to expand its military power in the future. Add this reality to China's economic and demographic problems, and the window for the mainland to reunify with the island through use of force might be closing rapidly. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese government was not happy about the renewal of the EDCA and the expansion of American military bases and financial investment in the Philippines. When the news came, the Chinese Foreign Ministry accused the United States and Philippines of increasing tension in the region and helping to destabilize it. For the Philippines, though, there is little choice but to strengthen its ties with the United States. As another country in the first island chain, it would be even more subjected to China's whims if it took control of Taiwan. Just like Japan, its airspace would be under threat if China controlled the skies over Taiwan. Its shipping and maritime commerce, already under stress from China's occupation of strategic real estate in the South China Sea, would be that much more inhibited. When seen in this light, it was probably foolish for the Chinese leadership to believe that the Philippines would ever come under its orbit to the extent that countries in the Eurasian interior would. In the affairs of nations, security considerations will almost always win out over economic considerations. Because of its geopolitical position, the Philippines cannot let China secure a hegemonic position in the Indo-Pacific region, which it would do if Taiwan were to fall. Therefore, it is in the interest of the Philippines to forge ties with and host the military of the only nation that can prevent such a thing from happening, the United States. China may have thought time was on its side, but the renewal of the EDCA might just mean that by 2049, China will be unable to attempt an invasion of Taiwan, let alone actually succeed in its plan. But what do you think? Do the new American bases in the Philippines shift the region's balance of power and threaten China's plans to invade Taiwan? If so, how heavily? Let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.